Good morning and welcome to Thursday Morning Torah. This morning, we're going to have a little talk about Joseph. And the burden of this approach here this morning, the essence of what we're going to talk about, is you might want to say the two Josephs, or at least the two ways of looking at Joseph, because I want to offer you the possibility of seeing Joseph as either a hero or not. How about that? Or as somebody whom one ought not to admire, which is another way of looking at him, and something that has certainly been suggested over the years, primarily, obviously, by modern commentators, not by classical commentators. But the reason that Joseph is so controversial, in part, is because Joseph attains power. And as we have discovered in our world, and I think in almost every world, it is virtually impossible to get power without controversy. And it is far easier in terms of one's moral reputation to be powerless. The powerless are rarely blamed. The powerful are always blamed. Now, sometimes that blame is richly deserved, sometimes not. But what happens to Joseph, of course, is that he goes from powerlessness to power. And here are two different ways of reading his story. One is, this is an obnoxious kid, right? Remember that we have read in last week's portion, Vayeshev, that Joseph has these dreams in which he imagines the cow, the stalks of wheat bowing down to him, the stars bowing down to him, and in each of these dreams, where he imagined these sheaves or stars, in each of them, he is obviously not only the star, but the storyteller. He recounts the dreams to his brothers and to his father, his mother being dead. And there's a long and interesting article, I think it's on Torah.com, I think, about whether Joseph's dreams are actually prophetic or not, given that he imagines his mother bowing down to him, and obviously she doesn't because she's dead. But anyway, then he goes to see his brothers at the behest of his father, which is something we may return to. They throw him into a pit intending to kill him. They don't kill him, and he goes to Egypt. Once he goes to Potiphar's house and does not sleep with his wife, which is also an episode that we will return to in a moment, he becomes viceroy to Pharaoh and institutes a policy that is effective for Egypt, but is brutal in some ways to the rest of the world. He stores up grain so that Egypt will maximize its power and then doles it out at his whim, which sounds very much like the child who thought he was going to be bowed down to by all and sundry. And he puts his brothers through a somewhat grueling, and some would say cruel, test, where he pretends that Benjamin stole his cup, and where he insists on keeping some of the brothers captive while they go get his father, the father whom he has not spoken to in decades, despite the fact that he's viceroy of Egypt, and presumably Egypt has a means of communication with Canaan, especially because we know that Egypt had tremendous influence over Canaan and often ruled it in ancient times. So this is a picture of Joseph that is somewhat unflattering. And you could fill out this picture and you could make it sing. That is, you could absolutely see this as a legitimate and defensible attack on Joseph's character, if you wanted to. The opposite side of this, which is the side that that I actually argue in the Jerusalem Post column that I wrote this week, is that Joseph grows into somebody who has the quality of empathy and of righteousness. That he begins again with the dreams, and then after being thrown into a pit and then thrown into prison, he notices that the cupbearer and the baker are distraught. They don't come to him. He says to them, "What's wrong? What's the matter?" Which is a quality of empathy that you would not necessarily expect from a young and somewhat obnoxious dreamer. Don't know what the right descriptor is, but he does notice, and then after he interprets, he is sensitive enough to notice Pharaoh's, to understand Pharaoh's anxieties and projections. And then, although I don't go on to this part of the story, and then what he's doing with his brothers is not actually torturing them, but testing them. He wants to know if in fact they've changed, and why he doesn't contact his father during that time I will return to in a moment. But after that, he comes down to them and says, "I am Joseph, your brother." And not only that, but every single time he has the opportunity, from the first moment that he speaks, which is to Potiphar's wife, he always attributes his gifts to others and expresses his gratitude. He says, "How can I do this to Potiphar? He's trusted me, he's taken care of me, and the only thing he's withheld from me is you, because you're his wife. And how could I sin against God?" And every time he's asked to interpret a dream, he says, "I don't interpret dreams, God interprets dreams." He says it to the cupbearer and the baker, he says it to Paro, and then he says to the brothers, "Don't blame yourselves for what you did. God intended this to happen." And so when the tradition calls him Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph the righteous one, I think it is because Joseph is constantly attributing the gifts of his life and the circumstances of his life to God. And he really believes in hashgacha, that is, in God's oversight of the world, and also hashgacha pratit, his oversight of his personal life and the way in which he conducts himself and the way in which he moves in the world. I want to talk about two pivotal incidents that I don't discuss in the column, but that are really important, I think, to one being the incident with Potiphar's wife, and the other being why Joseph doesn't contact his father, that you can fit into the framework of Joseph that you choose to use to estimate his career and his life. And also, just as a side note, before I get to those two, I do want to note, since tonight is the last night of Hanukkah, that Joseph's life is very much touched by miracle, by extraordinary circumstance. Not only is he picked up by traitors while he's sitting in a hole where the brothers are thinking to kill him, not only does he end up in the home of Potiphar, but he ends up in the prison with the two people, well, really the one person in the end, the cupbearer, who could restore him, who could bring him out of prison. You have to believe that ancient Egyptian prisons did not have a parole review board. And so if you didn't happen to meet someone who could vouch for you and suggest that you belong, outside of prison, you were in trouble. So there's that. And then, of course, the fact that he is able, when none of Pharaoh's advisors are able, to give him an answer to his dream, that Joseph is able to do so, and that Pharaoh shows his gratitude by putting him at a critical moment in the history of Mitzrayim in a position where he can make a critical difference, Mitzrayim being Egypt, a critical difference, and therefore use his leverage to bring his family in conformity with God's design. All right. First of all, so Potiphar's wife. Now you have to assume that Potiphar's wife is a sophisticated and beautiful woman, Potiphar being a rich man in ancient Egypt. And she wants to seduce Joseph. Joseph's reason, as I said, for not succumbing to the seduction is that Potiphar has been so good to him and he doesn't want to sin against God. As we have noticed in previous years of the Torah class, however, vayima'en, the word that says, and he refused, is one of the 6 or so instances in the Torah of a shalshelet. A shalshelet is a triple trill. It goes up and down the scale when you sing the word in Torah. And it clearly indicates some hesitation. He refused, but it wasn't so easy for him to refuse. He vacillated, he hesitated, he had a hard time. It's interesting that it chose that there. It clearly is not a cut and dried business. That she tried to seduce him and he said, no, Netflix, right? That's not the way it went. So how does he muster the strength? One of the very psychologically astute comments of the rabbis is that he saw the image of his father before him, which the Freudians out there would call the superego. Or the traditionalists would call, he believed, his heritage, right? The heritage of his fathers. And even there is a nice commentary by Chaim Sabato, who is an Israeli Sephardic rabbi, novelist, writer, who said, look, where are you, the Midrash says that Jacob and Joseph looked alike. Where in Joseph's life would he have seen a mirror? Where would he have really seen what he looked like? Well, maybe in the house of a wealthy woman in Egypt. So maybe he went into her boudoir, right? And there she had a mirror. She tries to seduce him. He looks in the mirror, he sees himself, and in his face he sees his father. So that is a nice way of thinking about the same idea. That is, whatever it was that enabled Joseph to resist, it suggests that even in Egypt, he managed somehow to retain the values with which he was born, with which he was raised. The fact that in the end of the Torah, he asks for his bones to be brought back to Israel, again, suggests that he was in Egypt, but not of Egypt. That in the end, he understood that Egypt was a temporary dwelling place. It was not his home, and that his home would be in Eretz Yisrael forever and ever. And although this we will save this for a later date, there is this beautiful, really beautiful scene at the end of the Exodus where Moses is occupied with locating the bones of Yosef, Atzmot Yosef, to bring back to Eretz Yisrael, to bring back to the land of Israel. But we will leave that for the moment. Nonetheless, it does speak to Joseph's connection to the land, and that's about the Potiphar question. The other question that I want to deal with with Joseph is, why doesn't he contact his father for all these years? And I'm not sure that there is any satisfactory answer to that. Now, I want to remind you, he leaves home to check on his brothers. His brothers throw him into a pit. He gets taken to Egypt. He works in Potiphar's house. He gets thrown into jail on a false accusation. He rises, then he interprets dreams. He goes to Pharaoh. He interprets the dreams of Pharaoh, and he becomes the viceroy of Egypt. And in all of this time, he never either succeeds or, as far as we know, even tries to get a message to the family of origin. And this is the sticking point in some way, the almost unanswerable problem that we are left with in the Joseph story, for which I have one or two possible leads, but not a satisfactory explanation. And I certainly welcome any alternative theories that you may have. So the first is anger, because you'll recall, or if you don't recall, I will recall for you, since that's my job, doing as the Torah class leader here. You'll recall that when Joseph recounts his dreams, it says immediately that the brothers hated him for his dreams. And right after that Yaakov, Jacob, Joseph's father, noted the fact that the brothers hated him for his dreams. So Jacob knows that his other sons hate Joseph. It doesn't say that Joseph knows. Joseph probably finds out when they throw him into a pit. He probably figures that out. Bright boy. But he may not know it ab initio. He may not know it at the beginning. But Jacob knows. And when they go off to pasture the sheep, which is what we talked about last week, and the guy from Dothan, when they go off to pasture the sheep, it is Jacob who sends Joseph after them. Now, if you're a father and you know that those boys hate your favorite, right? Remember, it gives them the coat of many colors. They know that you hate your favorite. Would you send your favorite off to find the brothers, to check on them, which is what it says, which may be benign, but isn't going to feel benign to brothers who hate Joseph in the first place? So I don't know the answer to that, but I can certainly imagine how Joseph would have answered that question. Because Jacob sends him to the brothers throw him in the pit, and then he is sold to Egypt. Now he has a long time to brood, not only in the caravan on the way, but also while he's working for Potiphar, when he's in prison, and even when he's in the palace of the Pharaoh. He must think to himself, why did my father, who must have known that they hated me, who loved me, send me to check on them? And why hasn't he tried to find out what happened to me? Because I was traveling for days and nobody seemed to check on me. The brothers knew, right? What did they tell my father? We got rid of him and maybe he was happy. I mean, you can imagine how he might construe that in his mind, given the reality that his father sent him in the first place. So one possibility is that Joseph thought that his father was either a part of this plot or thoughtlessly, heedlessly, callously enabled the plot. The other possibility is a combination of sadness and an attempt to move on. That is, Joseph perhaps thought, look, I obviously was meant to lead a different life. They rejected me wholeheartedly in that life. They tossed me into the pit, into slavery. I heard them talking that they were going to kill me. I'm now a little bit elaborating. So why should I attempt to rejoin a life from which I was rejected wholesale? My best job is to be in Egypt, and that's how he named his children. Or as one of my colleagues put it, Ephraim and Manasseh, if they're translated, are amnesia and assimilation. That is, he thought that he was going to be an Egyptian. And it wasn't until he saw his brothers that he realized that he was deceiving himself. That the full weight of who he was and of his love for his tradition and his father and so on came crashing back down on him, which is why the first thing he says when he reveals himself to his brothers is my father still alive? And that may be the other possibility of what is in fact going on with Joseph. It may be, as I said, that he is just unable, out of anger or out of a desire not to be caught in a world that rejected him, to reach back to his father. Now, what does this say about his character? That's a question worth asking. I think you could make more than one case about it, but at least it says that Joseph was torn up inside. And in this case, not by what he did, but by what he didn't do. It is the inaction that tells us that there was something painful in Joseph's life that he couldn't deal with adequately until, of course, he comes to the final conclusion, where he comes down from the steps and says, "I am Joseph, your brother. Is my father still alive?" And this phrase, "I am Joseph, your brother," is an incredibly powerful and dramatic scene. You know, he sends all the servants from the room. He can't contain himself. He breaks out in weeping, and there is this powerful reconciliation. Of course, at first the brothers are afraid, but then it seems as though Joseph forgives them, although even there, it's hard to entirely know, since forgiveness is such an internal quality, but surely he does them no harm. How he feels inside about them for the rest of his life, I don't think that is given to us to know. So there is that. There's also, which is something that we could deal with, there is also, especially this week, next week by Yigash, and maybe we'll talk about it next week, there is also a certain opposition between Judah and Joseph, reconciliation and opposition in those two major characters. But just a few more words about Joseph, and then any questions you might have. So Joseph's gifts are, like many people's gifts, double-edged. That is, Joseph was handsome, explicitly says that in the Torah. He was clearly charismatic. He was visionary, and he was loved, right? The coat of many colors. I quoted in my Jerusalem Post column about Joseph, I talked about the fact, I began with the Cyril Connolly quote, that whom the gods would destroy, they first called promising. Joseph was promising. That's from Connolly's book called Enemies of Promise. And Delmore Schwartz has a lovely little from his poem that's actually called Jacob, the whole poem. He has a lovely little comment that says, the gift is loved, but not the gifted one. The coat of many colors is admired by all, but he who wears the coat is not kept warm. And there is in that a reality of Joseph's life, which is that his gifts don't keep him warm. I just want to quickly run through 3 comments that have been made, or 4. Jim Friedberg, there's an interesting parallel and foreshadowing the Moses story. Absolutely. Joseph and Moses definitely have parallels. And also there are other echoes of the Joseph story later on. There are echoes in the David story of Joseph as well. Joseph is something of a paradigm of the young, promising person, what happens to him, this symbolism of what he wears, his attributing things to God, the way in which God does or doesn't speak to him, all of that. Jennifer said, it seems at the beginning he uses I and then doesn't. Well, he does a little bit later too, I am Joseph, your brother, but it does seem that he overcomes the egocentrism of the young person to be more, it's like Eric Erickson's stage of life, to be more generative in later stages. And Shelley said that the door was never closed. It depends which door we're talking about. The door for the brothers was closed. They hated him. They figured he died. They pretended he died. And I think they were completely shocked that Joseph was still alive. Maybe for Joseph's heart, it was not. For Jacob's heart, it was not. And there is something about the way in which Jacob reacts to Joseph's death. There's an exaggerated, immediate assumption that Joseph has died, and he goes right into mourning. Whereas if you find the bloody coat, you would think you would, get up a search party and try to find Joseph, but he doesn't. So there's a lot of deep emotional dynamics that are going on here. And it's hard to know what would happen. And then Farnas says maybe he thought that if he went back to Jacob, his brothers would kill him and Jacob will suffer. I think that that's true if he would go back. But what if he would send a messenger that says, your son Joseph is alive, and by the way, he's vice president. But vice president that is more than symbolic, because apparently he had real power, which vice presidents by and large don't in our system. So what would happen if that happened? That would be a very powerful, and I think perhaps transformative thing for Joseph, for Jacob, and then yes, it is certainly possible. It is certainly possible, as Moira says, that Joseph just decided to trust and accept. But I think that that's a little bit against the spirit of the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish tradition, to trust and accept and not act. Lo somchin al nes, you don't rely on a miracle. Although it's a delicate balance, I grant you, when you should accept and when you should act. There is no clear and fine line, and sometimes one, sometimes the other. But you would think that the Viceroy of Egypt would know how to act. And then finally, I want to close with a couple of remarks about this, which is something that Regina says. Joseph is very much a model of resilience, very much. And tonight we're having a Hanukkah concert, really a wonderful event. I hope that you will join us. It's on the Sinai Temple website. It will be on my Facebook page. You can look for the links on Twitter, on Facebook. A lot of wonderful people will be performing. Mayim Bialik will be there. 24K Golden, who's one of apparently the leading rappers in the world, will be there. All the rabbis, of course, will say something, and Henry Platt will speak about his experience with mental illness. That's what the concert is for. It's to promote awareness of mental illness. And there is something in Joseph's journey that is to the pit, to the jail, that is reminiscent of depression and or mental illness. In fact, one of the stories that Rabbi Guzik tells in this concert, which is a very famous story from Brachot, from the Talmud, is of a rabbi who suffers from depression, and another rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan, comes and lifts him up and makes him feel better. But then Rabbi Yochanan himself suffers from depression. And why can't he lift himself up? And the Talmud says, because the prisoner cannot free himself from jail. In other words, someone else has to come and help you. And so there is in the story of Joseph and in the Hanukkah story, this movement of darkness to light and this idea of resilience that Joseph exemplifies. And at the end, of course, of the Joseph story, which we haven't gotten to yet, but we will in a couple of weeks, when everybody gathers together and Jacob gives them their final blessing, that's when we're ready for the story of Israel, when we move from family to people. And it requires first, of course, that there is this sense of resilience and of promise. In these difficult days, I hope that you feel a sense of resilience and of promise. I think I can say without fear of contradiction that the vaccine is on its way. It may take a little while to get to you and to me, but it's on its way, and this is miraculous. On this Shabbat, in fact, I'm going to be talking about the miracles that we have seen this year, and we have seen some miracles here and in Israel. And I hope that you will join us on Shabbat morning. And in the meantime, stay healthy, be well, and Chag Hanukkah Sameach. I hope the last day of Hanukkah is a beautiful one for you, and hope that you will join us tonight at our concert. Take care.